I'm here. I really don't know why you're here. And I say that in jest only because I know that some of you are probably interested in this building that you see on a regular basis and have never been inside, and you want to know what's going on. There's other people who like architecture. They're church groupies. They like hearing about the history of churches. You like Wheaton. You live here. This is your community. A little extra history is not a bad thing. Or maybe you had nothing else going on Wednesday and this seemed like something to do. Regardless of why you're here, I'm glad you're here. Thank you so much for supporting me and our church and this program. So I'd like to take you back to early Wheaton, and with any kind of luck, this will all work. So we're off to a booming start. No. Okay. Well, there must be another way to do this, because okay, I didn't have the green light. Didn't have the green light to go. Still don't. There. Okay, there we go. Now we're all ready. So I'd like to take you back to Wheaton's early years. That many of you probably know this part, but the part that interested me was in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was a federal program that cleared out this whole area of all the Native Americans. And when they did that, it left all this wonderful Midwestern property available for farmers to move in from other parts of the country. So these three men, Erastus, Jesse, and Warren, came from Connecticut. They were farmers there, and they came from a little town called Pomfret. 300 years later, Pomfret still has 4,000 people. So it's a booming metropolis in the central part of Connecticut. And Erastus bought, or procured, I'm not sure who he would have bought the property from, but he gained 1,000 acres, pretty much where like Wheaton South High School is, Wheaton-Warrenville, sort of the Warrenville area. And Jesse and Warren sort of were more centrally located in Wheaton. So Warren had sort of the northern part of what is now downtown Wheaton, and Jesse had like another 600 or 700 acres south of that area. So it was a time of growth for this area, for people coming in to farm and to become more prosperous. But there was something that also went on when the trains came through. So Warren Wheaton was kind of a mover and shaker, and he didn't have much shaking going on in Pomfret. So he came out here and said, like, I'm going to make my mark. He wound up selling some of his land to the Chicago-Galena train line. And when that happened, we now were connected to Chicago in a way that we had not been. So now people were interested in coming out here, whether it was for the day or to live here, and they had this energy sort of building in the community. The next thing is we had Wheaton was incorporated, and the population was a booming 646 people. And I love the precision, 646, not 7, but 46. So then we get into the Civil War. You know, that upended everything for everybody. But by 1867, Wheaton became the county seat. And that was a very prestigious thing, and we all know the hassle between Wheaton and Naperville and all that good stuff. But Wheaton became the county seat at that point. And again, that was another prestigious thing that Warren Wheaton moved along. Wheaton College is named after Warren. So Wheaton College was not originally Wheaton College, and because of his benevolence, they decided to rename the school after him. 1871, the Chicago fire. So now downtown Chicago's decimated, and the people who live there are like, hey, this might not be the best place for us to live. We're living close together, there's a fire, we got wiped out. Maybe there's places out west that might be of more conducive to a happy life. So they started looking out in these west suburbs and moving out of the city, and they came across Wheaton. And now the Chicago businessmen arrived. These were men who came into the area because they were going to make a mark in business. They were interested in commerce. They were successful when they got here. They were not trying to make their mark. They already were established. The first person that we talk about is Judge Thomas Drummond, who became a federal level judge. He started down in Peru and has moved up. So he kind of kept going up through the ranks of judgeship until he was made a judge of the circuit up here. James Warwick is an individual that there's a little bit less known, and what we know is a little dicey. Warwick was in transportation, and some of the information we can find about him are court cases against him. So we're really not sure exactly what he was up to, but we do know that within 10 years he was gone from Wheaton. So not sure if he went under his own volition or not, but be that as it may. And then we have the Shearson family. And they were prosperous corn traders, growers and traders in Canada outside of Toronto. And they came here because Mr. Shearson, whose name is William Frederick Arundel Shearson, by the way, he was going to be in the Board of Trade and the Mercantile Exchange, that he was going to be a big mover and shaker within that environment of corn trading and agriculture. So we had three men who were here for different reasons, but their historical roots were in Great Britain. So that Drummond's grandfather had come from Scotland and settled in Maine. James Warwick was born in Scotland and came to the U.S. in 1854. And the Shearson family, as I mentioned, had come over from Canada after emigrating from England. And the importance to us at Trinity is that our faith base, the Episcopal Church, is part of the Anglican Communion, the collection of churches that fall under the auspices of the Archbishop of Canterbury in Britain. And so when they were looking to worship, they wanted something similar to what they had had in their home, which would be the Episcopal Church. So that was how they wound up being connected to our mission church. The fourth name here are the Perronays. And if you know anything about Wheaton, he was the mayor twice. And their family came to our church and were very prominent in the early days of our church, especially when the chapel was being built. And he and his family were very prosperous business people also. So this was just this time of very much of an industrial growth in Wheaton, that the people coming here were not searching for themselves or accidentally finding Wheaton. They came here because they knew that they could be connected to Chicago, connected to the farms. They were all gentlemen farmers also. They all had, fairly substantial amounts of property, not the thousands of acres that the Wheatons had, but they all maintained farms. The borders are different. Some of these folks lived a little closer to like Winfield than what would be Wheaton proper. But they were in this area, and they came to the point that they wanted to start a church. So in 1880, the population had doubled. So that's pretty good. Now we have 1,100 people. But again, it's different when you're in a farm community because the land is there's the population density is so different than when it's an urban area. So really 1,160 people is kind of a lot considering that we're 30 miles away from Chicago, and that these people were really connected to Chicago in a way that we are still today. So by 1875, these gentlemen decided that they wanted to have a place to worship. And they went to the bishop of the Episcopal Church and said, we would like to begin a mission church. So because our church our parish was begun in 1875, that's our 150 years. Because I know that you were looking at that number earlier and it said 1882, and it's like, the math doesn't work out, that's not 150 years ago. So really our parish started in 1875. So in 1880, the discussion was, okay, we have enough people together to build a church and to make it purposeful. So what are we going to do about it? So they start looking, I can only imagine, nobody told me this, I wasn't there, but the predominant styles at the time were the Queen Anne homes, the ones that, we often talk about, gingerbread homes. That was a really predominant residential style, and of course we still see homes like that here in Wheaton. The Richardsonian Romanesque was based on this architect by the name of, oddly enough, Richardson. And his big thing were these massive stone buildings with these rounded arches and very heavy buildings, very bulky buildings. And then there's our little wooden church that's Gothic Revival. And there's a lot of names for the style for a lot of different reasons. And we'll get into that in the next part. So a little bit about the engineering. You talk about a Roman arch. People are familiar with that. It's round. It has a keystone on it. But the big thing about that is the building is bulky and heavy. So think of it as a sumo wrestler. He's got big stocky legs, big body, little bitty head. No, but he's sturdy. He's sturdy. And the churches that follow the round Roman arch are like Byzantine, if you've heard that phrase, the Byzantine churches. So the church in the upper right is actually the Basilica of St. Louis. They cannot put in large windows because their walls are thick. Because like that sumo wrestler, they have to have heavy structure to support the roof and the upper stories of the building. So they also don't have a lot of windows for light or for storytelling or for any other purpose. So what do? They cover the interior with mosaics. So you cover them with mosaics or you cover them with frescoes, but you don't have the light coming in the way you do in other styles of buildings. Doesn't make them less beautiful, they're just different. The Gothic is much more like the model on the runway. Long, skinny legs and prone to falling over. So you have the Gothic arch, and it's a very lovely structure. But it does have one fault, and that is that if you don't do the math right, it can either implode or explode. So they're finding that many of the churches in Europe that were built centuries ago did not have exactly the right math, and that they're falling apart where those little horizontal lines are on the drawing, that they're either falling out or some of them are starting to cave in. And so they're doing a lot of structural reconstruction on these churches. And indeed, that was even a problem at our church that I'll talk about later. And one of the ways they solve that problem is that area that I have circled on Notre Dame de Paris at the bottom is, you've heard, flying buttresses. So there's two kinds of buttresses. One is a buttress that just is an addition to the wall, and it provides support. In effect, you're giving it sumo legs where you need it. Or you have these much more graceful flying buttresses, and the flying part refers to the fact that they extend out of the building and down to the ground, and they help transfer the load of the roof and the upper part of the building to these external structures, and that helps support everything. So the picture on the right is a reminder of how graceful and how light-filled these spaces can be. That's the new cleaned Notre Dame that was just reopened last December. So it's quite extraordinary. They said that it hasn't looked like that since it was built. And parts of it were built in the 1400s. So it's been a while. And I saw it probably 10 years ago, and it had not been obviously restored. And the first impression is, wow, it's really interesting, but boy, is it dark in here, because all that stonework after all the years had aged, the smoke, the incense, the candles, breath, that had darkened everything. And now I look at it and I'm like, that's absolutely not the church that I was in. But it's quite astonishing, and the fact that they could even get it open for people to come in is breathtaking. We were there just right before the fire. So in 1872, this gentleman by the name of Richard Upjohn published a book called Rural Architecture. And his contention was that we can create these beautiful buildings that are smaller in scale, easily obtainable, and the Episcopal Church grabbed it. They're like, we're going to take this and run with it. So there are hundreds of churches, mostly on the eastern half of the United States, that were built in this style, including St. John's Episcopal Church, which predates our building by several years. And some other ones that are on here that have the structure. So the idea was that he proposed, and tell me if I'm wrong here, sought to provide, quote, designs for cheap but substantial buildings for the use of parishes. I don't know a church that wouldn't be attracted to that. And so in the late 1800s, there was there artists and designers in Britain were pushing back against the Industrial Revolution. And so when we talk about like arts and crafts or a craftsman home, that's all springing from this turning our backs on industry. And they wanted to show the building, how it was built. They wanted to show the craftsman touch. So it's things like rough-hewn beams, pegged connections in the walls, exposed parts of the building, because they wanted to show that a craftsman was involved. So that was the arts and crafts movement, and because the Episcopal Church was attached to Great Britain, then it kind of all became this synergistic thing where this became a very appealing way of approaching the church buildings. So these ideas that Richard Upjohn provided in his book, it was widely circulated, and it became a little bit like the Sears houses, where you'd get your plan and build your house. Well, it was kind of like, here's a bunch of ways you can manipulate it, but you can see that the local architects just had a field day with like, hey, we can put something else here. We can make it a simple structure. We can add this, we can add that. So we have, bell towers, we have all kinds of like little filigree things, but it's all showing off what the craftsman can do, and that was a big deal. So here back to Wheaton, this, I love the photo. So the first photo is Henry Dan Compton. He worked with a man by the name of Aidan Childs Street here in Wheaton. So he was a big builder of homes. So Henry had been in the Civil War. That's his Civil War picture. And then the other picture is when he was fat and happy in his old age. Same man. So that was taken when he was in his 70s, and actually it was some celebration in the 1920s at Trinity. That's the exterior of the building there. And so he was responsible for doing the construction of the building, and that we're certain of. The thing that I keep pushing back on, and someday I'm going to get this answered for sure, is that Treat and Foltz were identified as the architects. And the reason why I feel that there's a little pushback there is that they were downtown Chicago building these very large commercial buildings and mansions in that Richardsonian Romanesque style, stone and everything that goes with it. Their buildings would have looked like the DuPage History Center, that. So like you look at our church and you look at that building and you're like, So it's kind of like, why would they be interested in designing this chapel? Maybe they did. But they're a very small firm at this point. They don't have 100 underlings, so it's not like they handed it off to a new architect. And what I think really was probably a little bit more like it is that Aidan Childs and Henry Compton worked on it together to take one of these designs that was in circulation, and Treat and Foltz were the official architects who signed off on the drawings so that everything was legit. Now, the men in the church were connected to Chicago, and it's very likely that they knew somebody, either Treat or Foltz, or maybe somebody who worked for them, or that they knew that it was a prestigious firm, and that was, kind of a cool thing. But I still kind of look at my building and look at their buildings and go, why would they be involved with this project? And I haven't been able to actually get that exact connection, but I'm still working on it, and someday I will figure that out. And I'll be happy to give them credit where credit's due. I just find it a little odd. So this photograph is actually the oldest picture that we have of our chapel. Why they took it from the back, I don't know, but this is actually taken from like the middle of our lot, looking sort of towards the corner of West and Wesley. So it's kind of an odd view, and I'm not sure what they were trying to prove with this photograph, but it's not an image that we can really recreate because we have other buildings that have been added to the property. So this is our oldest one. And some of the things about this rural Gothic are really evident in our church. So one of them is the peak roof. There are very few roofing companies that want to deal with it. It's very steep. So every time we have some loose shingles, it's kind of a trauma because it's like, are they going to come and do it this time? Because, it's a challenge, shall we say. So in 1881, 82, there was a publication that expressed the notion that a wooden building need not be temporary. So the guidelines were, the site should be on a slight rise, preferably on a corner, check. It should be oriented east and west. So in churches, generally, you have the altar is backing up to the east, so that when the sun rises, it's rising behind the altar. We couldn't make that happen. So it faces east-west. It's just that the altar's at the west end and the front door is basically at the east end on West Street, which is also difficult to explain to people. The east end is on the west side. Anyway, so that was the religious significance of trying to have it east-west, but it is at least the next closest thing that we could do there. So even though Trinity is a little bit backwards that way, the floor plan is very much why, also part of this idea of keeping things simple. So the nave is the part where all the pews are. So that main part was supposed to be just straight. Sometimes people refer to that as a basilica shape because it's just straight. There are no arms, like a lot of churches have side chapels or side parts of the building. And then the area that's the small end on your left, that's where the altar is. They suggested that to have the perfect church, that area, the apse, should be slightly smaller, which it is. So we have all of those lovely little things going on. At the same time, power tools, or power-aided tools, they were probably steam-driven, were becoming important. And so they did scroll work, which is why we wound up with the gingerbread houses, because they had new tools and they could do all this crazy cutting of wood and making it decorative. So because we're kind of keeping things simple, we do not have a lot of excess decoration on the building. But you can see over the doorway, there's like a little arch. On the front of the building, above the windows, there's a little bit of detailing. So the exterior is really very serene and very simple. Many of the Gothic churches were painted brown. I grew up in New England, classic little white church on the square. That really wasn't reality for a lot of places around the country. So brown was not a particularly unusual color. So our church was brown. And then somehow somebody decided in the 1920s it should be painted white. So it was white for about 10 to 15 years, and by the 1950s it was brown again. I don't know what went on there, but we have some of these pictures and it's like, oh look, it was white. But we have had some historical work done, and this was the original color. The other thing is some of these rural Gothic buildings had vertical siding, and later styles like ours has the horizontal. And that has also been a challenge in trying to get pieces replaced over the years and staying true to the style of the siding. So it's an interesting sort of piece of property from that standpoint. It's a very, humble building, but it's really a fascinating building. So this is our main. This is from the back of the church, looking up towards the apse, towards the altar, and it seats 140 people, which was, 1/10 of the population of the city at the time. So they were thinking big. And in reality, we refer to this as our chapel, but it's really our historic church. And because we have another church building on the property, we have resorted to calling it the chapel. But a chapel generally is a place for private contemplation, for small services like a baptism, or just quiet prayer. And so they often only seat maybe 10 people, maybe even less. If you've ever been in a really big cathedral, there's what they call like little chapelettes along the outside, and there's just usually like a kneeler there, and that's all, and maybe some candles. That's a chapel. This is really a church. And we use this church 3 times a week on a regular basis. So it is not just a historical monument. It's a living part of our parish life. That we have services Wednesday morning, Saturday night, and Sunday morning. And then our main church is used for our larger family service later Sunday morning. So we have historical records about things that were donated to dress the church. And one of the other mysteries I haven't been able to solve is someone donated what they call a choir screen. And a choir screen is either wood or metal that goes between the riffraff in the audience, in the congregation. So it's between the congregants and the mystery of the church at the front. And because it's kind of a small building, I think they may have felt that that was a little oversold, that they weren't going to put that in, because I don't have any photographic reference at all of what this screen would have looked like. And it would have blocked a lot of the view, even if it was made out of metal. There's a church in Chicago that has a metal screen, and it's very open, but it would have been very distracting, I think. And so I don't know whatever happened to that, and I don't know what they did with the money instead. So it's one of those little oddities that we have it in our record that someone donated it, but we don't have any evidence of it. This is the interior structure. It is oiled wood. Most of it is fir, oddly enough. I didn't think of this particularly, but when I started finding these old pictures, it was a very wooded area. This was not farmland in downtown Wheaton. It was very wooded. And so it may have even been local trees at that point. But the structure here is called false hammer beam trusses. And what that is that they have this work up under the roof, and that's taking all the structure. There is no attic. What you're looking at is the underside of the roof. And all of that structure then transfers the weight to the sides. And then there's these little short, what they call hammer beams on the wall in the upper right there. And that transfers the weight to them. When you talk about a building structure architecturally, they refer to the walls and the ceiling as the envelope. Well, in order to make the envelope more rigid, they actually attached the pews to the outside wall. I didn't think anything of that. It's a small church. You've got an aisle down the middle. You're good to go. Well, as it turns out, they put those pews all the way to the wall and attached them to help strengthen the walls of the church. And if you ever go in our chapel on a breezy day, it has a lot of creaking. It's like that old wooden floor. The whole building is like an old wooden floor. And so part of it was that they knew that they had the structure that they were supporting with these hammer beams at the top, but otherwise the building's just going to flip out. So they pulled it back in by putting the pews as an integral part of the structure of the church. So this system of using this kind of bracing and these hammer beams allows for a nice big open area. And there is a part on here, let's see if I can be really cool, right there. There's a bar that goes across, and it's a big tie rod that was added in the 50s because the building was spreading out. And so there are 2 buttresses outside of our building that hold it together, because that span there was starting to it wasn't starting to fail, it wasn't that dramatic, but there was definitely pressure that was moving it to outside, and they needed to rein it in. And because there's no pews holding the walls in the front, because the pews go actually in the other direction for the choir, they wound up having to put this tie rod in. And it's worked just fine, and the building's not going anywhere, and we're all very happy with it. So, but you can see some of the other lovely little details too, like over our doorway, up here in the corner of the brace, that we have 2 different colors wood. You know, they were still ornamenting the building, even though it was made with humble materials. This is the part that I think the people who are anxious about windows will get into. W.H. Wells and Company opened their doors in 1870. And for those of you who are familiar with Chicago history, 1893 was the Chicago Exposition. And they were such a big firm at the time that they actually had a display at the Columbian Exposition. So by 1873, so they opened in 1870, 3 years later they had 40 men working for them and produced glass valued at $75,000, or about $2 million in today's money. So they were a big deal. And if you stop and think about any of your friends or family or buildings you've been in that were built in this late 1800s, even over into the 1900s, they all had leaded glass. Oftentimes in the living room, there might have been a little trim across the top. The stairs to go upstairs, that landing always had a colorful window. There were 120 glass-making companies in the city of Chicago at this time, because everybody had to have some. This window here is symbolic of our original windows, that they are unadorned, there is no story, but the craftspeople couldn't resist doing something. So they all have different borders in different colors, and they're all different patterns. So the windows all have the same diamond glass with this lovely little floral pattern that was painted on with glass paint and then fired. So they're all very similar that way, but these little borders are all different. And I just think that's really kind of an interesting thing, that when you walk in, they're not all purple or they're not all blue. There's a red and green one. Then there is a only green, only red and blue, purple. So it adds a liveliness to the windows that is not necessarily a common thing. These are some of the glass windows that are at the front of the church, here on the left, and the patterns are painted on and then fired. And because of the technology at the time, some of the firing is uneven. So it's not that we've scrubbed these windows so many times that we're scrubbing the paint off. That's not the way it works. But it has flaked off due to age because it wasn't fired properly. So you get this sort of uneven quality of some of the painting, but that's part of it being old, and that's part of it being done at the time. And you can see in that larger piece there that it's all very different as you go around the circle. One side's very red, the other side's kind of stripy looking. That's because the firing, if you can imagine putting glass in an oven, it's like baking a cake. One corner always seems to get more cooked than the other corner. It's the same thing with the glass. So the other windows on the other side are windows that are smaller windows that we have towards the front of the doors and actually at opposite ends of the building. And they have what to me looks almost like handbells. So rather than flowers, they have a little bit of a different pattern like in here. You can see that there. And the other windows had like a little flower cluster. But again, they kind of went crazy with the borders. You know, they're like, if they're going to make me do clear glass, almost clear glass, I'm going to have fun with the other stuff. And they did these lovely decorative borders, and it just adds a liveliness to these windows that really make it a pleasure to view. These are our 3 windows that are behind the altar. Excuse me. They're called the chancel windows. So these windows, the center panel has this lovely painted piece that has grapes and wheat symbolizing the wine and the bread at communion. The windows were donated by the Pyrenees that we mentioned earlier. That he had come up here to begin an investment firm. So being the mayor, he was pretty prestigious, and this was all prior to him becoming the mayor. The windows on the left and the right are memorial windows. The window on the left with the A, the alpha, was dedicated to his father. The omega window on the right was dedicated to Fanny Pyrenee's mother. So that was John Stephen Pyrenee and Elizabeth Gould Baker. They're really lovely windows, and the blue is very intense and very well fired, very well painted. They must have cost a fortune. They are beautifully done, and they're holding up very, very well. And they're very indicative of the time period, that there's 2 kinds of windows in churches where you have stories, you know, you're telling Bible stories, or you're using Christian symbols. And these fall into the Christian symbol category. And the vibrancy of the color and the patterns is all very much a part of that craftsman style that was very popular in the 1800s, or the 1880s. The following window is one that I have on high authority, was the window that they would sit the misbehaving children under because it had the all-seeing eye of God. So several of my peers claimed that that was their permanent seat. So this one is the all-seeing eye, or the eye of providence, that is in the upper third of the window there. It is also beautifully painted, which makes it super creepy. You have to kind of put yourself in that 1800s kind of mode when you look at it and go, okay, everybody got it when they did this. The lily, the Easter lily, is a sign of resurrection. It is part of, you know, a memorial. And the WB at the bottom was for William Baker, and this was Fanny Pyrenee's father. So this was dedicated to him. He was a publisher of the Chicago Journal of Commerce. So he was another one of those people that was sort of a big mover and shaker in the greater community. So this is the window that we promote more than any other window in the chapel, because it really is a lovely, extraordinary window. It is full of Trinity symbols. So anything that has to do with 3 was put in here. The thing that I found very fascinating is this was donated by the Shearson family. And maybe you've heard of the investment firm Shearson Lehman. Same Shearson. It was his son Edward went to New York and began that investment firm. So they were very well connected, very wealthy people, but they had the misfortune of having 8 children, 2 of whom died. And so this was dedicated to their daughter. And it has, in addition to her information at the bottom, actually they had 1 daughter who died, but it has 3-leaf clovers. It has the 6-pointed star. And people are like, was this ever like a Jewish temple? And I'm like, no. The 6-pointed star is often called the Creator's star, but it also is a folk symbol, because if anybody does sewing or quilting, it's 2 triangles. It is much easier than a 5-pointed star when you're trying to do a pieced quilt. So that Creator's star was a very common folk symbol, but because it's made of 2 triangles, it's also a very Trinitarian symbol. We have ferns that there's 3 fronds in each triangle. We have the Borromean interlocking Ballantine windows that we have 3 inner circles and 3 outer circles. We have triangles, overlapping circles. So it is just full of Trinity symbols. So it is Trinity to the nth degree, that when they put this window together, that was what they had in mind. Let's put in everything we can think of that has to do with the Trinity and make a beautiful window. The window in the upper right is from Galt, Canada, the family home of the Shearsons before they moved here. Oddly enough, their church was named Trinity, and their church is still standing. It's still a place of worship in Canada, and that is their window. And there's a lot of commonality. Now, obviously, it wasn't the same artist that did the 2 windows. I'm not thinking they brought somebody in from Toronto. But as the Shearsons commissioned this, they clearly had fond memories of their home church and sort of emulated a similar style for that window. It has different iconography, but there's a lot of similarity to it with the triangles and the plants in 3 pieces and that sort of thing. Immediately below that window is what we refer to as the Drummond Memorial Window. And this is Judge Thomas Drummond, had 8 children, and they're the ones that had 2 daughters who died, and that's their initials are on the bottom of this window. It was dedicated to them. And this one is full of Christian symbols. Without telling a story, these are symbols that people, especially of that time, would have been clued into. So there is Christ as the anchor that we have in that one medallion. We have a cross with, again, clovers. We have mustard seeds. So in here, we have the crown and cross, which is heavenly reward after suffering earthly trials. We have olives and branches, which is another part in here in the medallion. And then we have a quote from one of our prayers is in here. One of the things that makes this interesting is these little areas in here are like bottle bottoms. They're called rondelles, so they add a texture to this window. And it's a very large window, so it's very impressive. It really is very dynamic color. The variations of color is just very stimulating. Nobody was worried about having a theme, just in case you were wondering. So because these were all memorial windows, they were very personal to the people who had them designed. So they just designed what was appropriate for them, and it was installed. So it's a lovely, lovely window. This next window is really an odd memorial window in that we have no idea who this is. It has a name, it has an initial at the bottom. They put the buttons too close. This area where there's the initials and the date, we can't figure out who that is. I mean, JS, you would think, well, it's the Shearsons. 1854 was before the chapel was built, but that doesn't track with anybody from his family, so we don't really have any record, and I don't know why, but we don't. The butterfly is another symbol, another memorial symbol of resurrection, and then we have the descending dove. On the right-hand side, there's a Maltese cross that has letters in it. It is very, the paint is beautiful as the paint is on the butterfly. It is totally not on the cross. It's difficult to read, and we've never really been able to quite figure out exactly what it's referring to. So it's kind of our one mystery window in the church. So in 1882, the church was finished. It was consecrated. The population of Wheaton had grown by another 50%, up to 1,600 people. In 1893, the Columbian Exposition happened, and that got everybody excited about a lot of different things. And so we installed an organ, a big pipe organ. At the time, it was $1,000. So, you know, in today's money, it would be a lot more. By 1900, we had over 2,300 people. So the city is definitely growing. The parish is growing. Everything's going really well. By 1900, that was our last memorial window gets placed, and then it stays kind of put for about another 50 years. So our final memorial window is this one. This one is called the Resurrection Angel window, and this is also the Drummond family. That this was honoring Judge Drummond when he died, and it was placed by his family, we think in about 1910. It was designed by a woman from Lombard who had studied at the Art Institute, opened up her own studio in the Arts Building across the street from the Art Institute. And she was primarily a jeweler, but she did glass, she did jewelry, she did a number of different arts. I personally found out about her when we did our program in 2013, when we were in 2012, when we were doing the 130th anniversary of the building. We started doing some of this research, and I was at the Historic Society in Lombard talking to them about borrowing garments for this fashion show that we were going to have of wedding gowns, historic wedding gowns. And she said, hey, have you ever heard of this artist, Christia Reed? I'm like, no. She says, I think she designed a window in your chapel. So it turns out that she did, that this was a piece that was very much of her portfolio builder. This was something that was such a wonderful window that she really garnered a lot of attention for this. She produced exquisite jewelry and watercolors, and I think her painterly approach to this window is very evident. It's very different in style to the other windows. The thing that I like the most is on this angel, we have this, it's glass, it's called opalescent glass, it's kind of milky. Her halo is much more transparent, and when the sun hits the window, it glows with a burst of light that is very different than the rest of the window. I mean, the whole window is nice and bright and lovely, but that just, you know, is so much more substantially bright because the glass is clearer. And it was just a really clever bit of artistry in it. It is done much more in the style of what we think of as Tiffany windows, where they used glass that followed the shapes. There are pieces that are painted, like obviously her face, her hair, but things like the flowers and the flower petals, there's little ridges in the glass that follow the shape of the flower and so forth. And it's a very artfully done window. And then there's the large memorial plaque at the bottom, which is a very sort of 1910 sort of expression. So then we get to 1912, and things are, I have a drawing here. This is the plat of survey showing that they've added a little building in the back that they needed, you know, some extra space for classes, and that's where we stood in 1912. Well, by the 1920s, the building was 40 years old. Let's face it, it was old. It was time to get a new building. New century, exciting, like let's do something really cool. So they came up with this layout. They were going to tear down the chapel. They were going to build a new sort of Anglican, English-inspired extravaganza. And if you think about Gary Methodist here, Gary Memorial, very similar in style. It was going to be stone, it was going to have a huge parish hall, it was going to have a little itty-bitty chapel, it was going to be quite astonishing. The most amazing thing to me is that it was going to have a swimming pool in the basement. And that's what the drawing is on the bottom. So in the 1920s and 30s, the churches were part of the community in a recreational way. It was a way to keep kids off the street, much like it is today. And so when they were looking at building this, they were like, we'll put in a swimming pool. And if you've ever been to historical homes built in the 20s and 30s, often they had saltwater pools in the basement or the lower level. That's what we were going to have, and I am ever so grateful that we did not have to remediate that. So this didn't go anywhere. But what did get built was the parish hall. So it runs from behind the chapel to what would have been this new big church. And that was built in the 20s. That was built in 1924. And that's still the building that we're working with now. We've had it remodeled and added on to. But it was built with a 2-story ceiling to be used as a basketball court. And it had a stage at one end so that we could have programs of betterment and music and theater and those sorts of things. And it had a lovely sort of carved arch around the opening, and that remained in place for a good long time, right, Catherine? So, so it was there on into the actually up until the 90s when we had it remodeled. This is the white church phase. So they were looking at this and saying, what are we going to do? So they wound up building the little building that's darker in the back. That was the parish hall. The building on the left was a small meeting room. And that stayed in place now for quite a good long time, until the baby boomers arrived. And when we arrived, there was no place for us to go. The church holds 140 people. We had 300 children registered in our school. So it was kind of like, you know, we need a bigger building. And over the years, it was like, well, we'll just kind of patch. By 1950s, they're like, we cannot patch. We're running kids across the street to the rectory for preschool. We have kids in the basement. We have kids in the parish hall. We have kids in the church. The kids couldn't attend church with their parents because there was no room. So in the 1950s, they're like, we have got to get a new, bigger building. And again, they're going to tear down the chapel. So now they're going to tear down the chapel. They're going to connect a new, smaller chapel that was only going to seat like 20 people and connect it to the main church with a covered walkway called a cloister. And again, it was going to be this lovely extravaganza of a building. And somebody said, you know, I don't know that we have enough money to do all that. This is going to be really, really expensive. We'll deal with the chapel. We've got a parish building. We're good. Let's just build the bigger church. And that's what they wound up doing in the 50s. So we wound up having that building. They began doing, the priest who was the priest in charge at the time had to have spent almost every waking moment raising money, because it was an extraordinary thing to build the church, provide all the windows, all the furnishings, all at once. You know, most churches, it's like we'll build it in pieces and in stages, and we'll add stuff as we go. He wanted it to be complete, and he knew that he was going to be leaving the parish for another position, and he wanted to have it all under his control at that time. So that was kind of an interesting thing. But that's twice now that they tried to tear down the chapel, and they decided not to. So by the 1970s, they said, look, if we're going to have this chapel, we've got to fix it up so that it's not going to fall on anybody's head. And they started really approaching it from a standpoint of what can we do to make it sound, to improve it. One of the things was that the floor was very slopey. Well, if your floor slopes, it's probably because your underpinnings are messed up. And that was true. So they did a tremendous amount of work in the basement, shoring up the floor, getting things straightened out. They did an architectural reevaluation of it. And in 1975, it was our 100th anniversary of the parish. And so they were looking forward to that, and they're like, we want to get this fixed up. And they polished, and they fixed windows, and they did everything they possibly could to bring it up to you know, really beautifully polished finish. And in 1978, it wound up on the, they had it added to the Register of Historic Places. So the Register of Historic Places started in 1966. And for those of you who remember the 60s, that was also like Earth Day and all kinds of things about how we don't want a disposable society. We want to reuse and reinvent and remake. So the Historic Register is only a register. It has no legal recourse. So if we wanted to tear down the chapel tomorrow, we don't have to ask anybody's permission. It's our chapel. We can do with it as we choose. Just because it's on the Historic Register does not mean it has any kind of official protection. But we have no intention of tearing it down. We've become rather fond of it. In fact, we're so fond of it that in 1975 we put another window in. And this one tells a little bit of the history of the church. So we have the picture of the chapel with a portrait of our longest serving leader. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we had the bishop from, the Archbishop of Canterbury was coming to Chicago from Britain. And so he came to our church along with the two bishops in Chicago, and they were involved in a very elaborate ceremony in our chapel. So this window was commissioned, and it was actually made in Austria, even though it was designed by a group from here in Chicago. So it was very exciting for them to get things on the National Register of Historic Places. There are only a handful of buildings in Wheaton that are on there, and only several churches in all of DuPage County. So that was quite a little nicety, shall we say. But it did give people that firm belief that this building was worth keeping and maintaining. In the 1990s, we had some historic work done. Some engineers came in, they examined the paint, the finish on the walls. It was an important part of making sure that we're taking care of this building properly. At that point, they stripped some of the walls inside because it was natural finish, not painted finish, and so those kinds of things were revealed at that time. So now as we go into our 150th anniversary, we're going to put in a new window that is not this window. I think it would be cute, but it's not. We are in the process of choosing a window still, but it will be there for the future to celebrate and mark our 150th anniversary. I didn't want to put anything that looked even remotely like what we're looking at because I didn't want to tip our hat, but we're hoping to have this window installed by the end of the year, and we are working with some agencies, some studios here in Chicago, and have some lovely concepts that we're working on, and we will let you all know when we're going to have a big old open house with that new window in place, because that will be quite an exciting thing for us, because it will be the first new window in 50 years. So now we have a little genealogy to wrap things up with, and this brings things up to the 21st century. So we start with Erastus Gary, who had a brother by the name of Jude. He married a woman by the name of Margaret Kimball. They had a son. They had a bunch of kids. But one of them was George Perrin Gary, who begat Alfred Caton Gary, if you're familiar with the street, Caton. He married Harriet Childs, daughter of the builder of the chapel. Her sister is Tirzah, and she married, guess who? Henry Compton, who built the chapel. So it was all kind of like everybody knew everybody, and there you go. Well, that was then. And so now we have Harriet Childs and Alfred had a daughter by the name of Laura. Laura got married in our chapel in 1916. And then their daughter, Joan Clem, married a gentleman by the name of Rodemaker, or her maiden name was Rodemaker. She married a man, Richard Clem. They got married in 1949 at our church. And her sister-in-law is Martha Joe, who married her brother. So we have all these people coming down from the Gary family, and the dog is on there because Joan was a national judge for Rottweilers. And that was her big claim to fame, was dog training and breeding of the Rottweiler breed. And Wheaton was the home to this organization that became internationally famous. And she judged dog shows all over the world. So Martha Joe and Joan both passed last year. Martha Joe was 102, and Joan was 98. So that was the end of that Gary family tree at our church. The other family that still has connections to our church is the Perrinays. So they're the ones that donated, the windows behind the altar. Their granddaughter, Margaret, passed in 2009 at the age of 99. She married Judge Bertram Rathje, who was an attorney. They had a number of children, and 2 of them are still affiliated with Trinity Church. So we go all the way from the Perrinays, who put in these windows in the 1880s, all the way to 2025, and we have this direct line back to them. So it makes it really a very intimate experience to have people that we have known intimately in the last handful of years who were connected all the way back to the founding of our church and the building of our chapel. So, credits. Thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you for the historic group for allowing me to do this, and the library welcoming. I am open for questions if you have any questions or concerns or points you'd like to point out. Yes, sir.
Great. Let me come to you with the microphone. Just a moment, please.
Very interesting. Graham Burnham.
Thank you very much. Is there a limit on the number of windows that you can put in?
We have 5 empty spaces at this point, and so we will be taking 1 for our window, and we will still have several that are available future forward. There hasn't been anyone who has come to us about doing a memorial window, but there are opportunities for that space to be taken. So actually, the most recent one in 1975 was really a celebration window, and this one will be a celebration window, so there's a little bit of a break from that historic tradition of having memorial windows, but there's no saying that, you know, someone who would approach us about it, you know, who was a member of the parish and was active in the parish and wanted to do that as a memorial, that, you know, we certainly would be considerate of that.
But actually, the Ockerlands are here, who their family donated that 1975 window.
There you go.
And I believe it was for an anniversary as well, correct?
Right. It was. So the window was donated for the 25th wedding anniversary of Sarah Jane and Frederick Ockerland. And then it was coincidental to be the 100th anniversary. So we have members of their family here, much to my surprise. I'm like, I think that's Charlie. So again, you know, we have this connectivity to the past, and it makes it a very vibrant place. As I said, it's really our historic church, and we really embrace it. Any other questions or comments?
Any other questions? Just raise your hand. I'll be happy to come to you with the mic.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Given that all of the walls are wood, it appears that are they oiled?
Yes.
Given that sheen and
Yes.
everything? Okay.
Yes. That's where we had them painted, because we thought that's what it was. And then when we had them analyzed, they said, no, they were originally oiled. So if you are very carefully observed, you can see sort of little edges where there's still a little bit of that discoloration from the paint. But that's what gives it that lovely contrast between the wood that's darker wood, the wood that some of it is painted wood, and then the majority of the walls and the ceiling are all oiled.
Okay, and while we have a chance to think of one more question, Beth, you gave me a link to the website, and that will give information about some of the celebrations coming up. Is that correct?
Correct. So on your seats, there were a couple of pieces of paper about some upcoming events we have. We are going to have open houses on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, some Sundays, in the next several weeks through the month of May. We also are having an art show and sale for in honor of one of our late members, John Legg, who was a sculptor and a printmaker, and that will be on the weekend of the 16th, 17th, and 18th. That's the next project I have to get to, and do another PowerPoint. And so there's that. In the back, on the back table, there are some brochures. If you or anyone you know are interested in using our chapel as a location for wedding vows or renewals, we have some information about that. And we also have little window clings that are printed like our rose window. And so you just peel off the back and stick it on your window, and it's transparent, and it gives you that effect of stained glass. And it's just kind of a charming little thing, and if you're interested, they're back there. So those are things for you to keep in the back of your mind, but you are welcome to come to our open houses. It's 10 to 2 on Fridays, 10 to 2 on Saturdays, and on the Sundays that will be open, which the next time will be the 18th, is from noon until 3. So I hope that some of you get a chance to stop by and see it in person. And the link that we refer to is the parish link, and there's further information about the building and things. And most of what I covered here is online, and you can review it at your leisure.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one more question.
when the organ and pipes were removed, they made a wall that looks like the rest of them, except that it doesn't. Was the wood not available anymore?
Some of it has to do with the age of the wood, but some of it, I believe, from the notes that I've seen, the pipe organ was removed and we had an electronic organ placed in the back of the church at that time in the early 1970s. They wanted to maintain some of the look of what was originally there. So there was actually an arched opening where the organist was. So they left that and then filled it in with wood. And because the wood that they were trying to match was already aged wood, they have the right species and the right color, but it doesn't quite match up because it doesn't have the aging from the wood that was already, almost 100 years old. But they wanted to leave that trim there as a reminder of what was there. So rather than stripping that all out and just making it a big flat wall and replacing the whole wall, they chose to just patch the doorway, as it were, in there. So that's...
So thank you so much, Beth.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
And we're also grateful to our partnership with the Wheaton Historic Commission. So go ahead and look for that follow-up email from me.